Thank you for joining us for this episode of Comply on the Fly with M3 and Karen B. Comply on the Fly is your trusted weekly resource for reliable insight and quick answers on common employee benefits compliance questions. Please note, this podcast and the contents herein do not constitute legal advice. Seek the advice of counsel for any employee benefits compliance-related guidance or strategy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Karen B. And the Comply on the Fly question of the week is, it involves voluntary plans. We get the question quite often on whether or not voluntary plans that an employer sponsors are subject to ERISA, which is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. Why do we get this question? Because if voluntary plans are subject to ERISA, the employer would have to comply with all ERISA requirements for those plans, including the SPD or summary plan description requirement, as well as the 5500 filing requirement, just to name a few. So let's discuss what voluntary plans are. Think of plans that you sponsor that are 100% paid by the employee. These plans would typically be something like a critical illness plan, an accident plan, or could even possibly be dental or short-term disability. The key is you offer these plans on a voluntary basis. Employees have the choice of enrolling in them, but they pay for them. And they are typically considered welfare benefit plans, which would make them subject to ERISA. However, next, let's review the ERISA voluntary plan safe harbor. Meaning, if the welfare benefit plan you sponsor falls under the safe harbor, it is exempt from ERISA. In order for your voluntary plans to fall under this safe harbor, they must meet all of the following requirements. 1, the employee must pay 100% of the applicable premium, and you, as the employer, cannot make contributions to the plan. 2, the employee's participation in the plan is completely voluntary. 3, you, as the employer, cannot receive consideration, which is typically payment, for administrative services such as payroll functions, other than quote unquote reasonable compensation. And finally, 4, you, as the employer, cannot endorse the plan. I think the focus here is typically on the last one, you, as the employer, endorsing the plan. Of course, this would be a facts and circumstances situation in which the DOL would most likely look at what you were actually doing in relation to endorsement. But we do know of one thing that most likely will tip the plan or plans into the ERISA zone. And that is if you allow employees to utilize your Section 125 plan in connection with those voluntary plans. Or, in other words, allow them to pay for the voluntary plan premiums on a pre-tax basis. This has been viewed as something that would constitute endorsement. And if endorsing, then you must comply with ERISA in relation to these plans, as it would take them out of the voluntary plan safe harbor zone. If the voluntary safe harbor is not met, then you would need compliant SPDs, summary plan description, for each voluntary plan, or if you have an ERISA mega wrap SPD, meaning you wrap all welfare benefits into one ERISA plan, then it must be listed as a covered plan or plans. And of course, because the plan or plans are now subject to ERISA and have SPDs or are included in SPDs, the 5500 filing requirement would apply. If the voluntary plans are separate ERISA plans, then the 5500 filing would only be required if the total number of participants, which is employees, is 100 or over on the first day of the plan year. However, if included in an ERISA wrap or mega wrap plan, you will need to include Schedule A's for the voluntary plan if any plan included in the wrap goes over 100 participants and triggers a filing. Bottom line, understand that your voluntary plans may be subject to ERISA and take action accordingly. And that is your Comply on the Fly question of the week. Thanks for tuning in.
What's on your mind? If you have a pressing compliance question, send it to askkarenb@m3ins.com. We'll do our best to cover it in an upcoming episode. You can now follow and subscribe to Comply on the Fly on Spotify, iTunes, and Google Podcasts. Make sure to tune in next week and encourage others to join us.